Today, we're speaking with Karenna Gore and James Patton on the connections between climate change and violent conflict and the role faith communities can and are playing. Karenna is the founder and director of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and the recent recipient of the 2020 Faith in Action Award from the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. James is the president and CEO of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
I thought a good question for us to start is just to kind of at the basics of that intersection of climate change and violent conflicts. You often hear of those two referred to one another in terms of a threat multiplier. That's a term that the U.S. Pentagon has used when talking about climate change. So, what does a threat multiplier of climate change mean in this context when it comes to violent conflicts?
Karenna, would you like to kick it off, or do you want me to start?
I think I'll let you start with this one, and I'll follow.
Gotcha. As ICRD is a conflict transformation organization, we focus on these issues pretty specifically, and we hear a lot about obviously climate change and sort of how it's tied into political platforms and personal change and some of the elements of maybe lifestyle transformation that have to happen. But I think we overlook on occasion the way that it impacts on the dynamics of conflict. And so, climate change, it's not really just about sea level rise and different temperatures in different places in the world. But of course, if the sea does rise a meter, it'll put 1 billion people on the move. And those people go to places that are already economically stressed. And oftentimes that causes clashes between groups of migrants and the host communities that they land in over resources that are not available in those places already. And then you add to that changes in rainfall patterns, seasonal glacial melt, and how that affects fresh water availability, crop viability, high heat, increased winds, drier conditions, contributing to wildfires. All of these things have an incredible impact on water and food availability, on livelihoods, on infrastructure, and that pushes people to struggle with one another, usually people who are already economically disadvantaged, to struggle with one another over scarce resources. And when they do that, it very easily manifests in the kind of identity conflict that ICRD works on. So people start to scapegoat one another around things like their tribes, their ethnicity, their faith. You see this oftentimes with migrant groups, particularly if they're moving across borders from the global south to the north, or underdeveloped to more developed countries that have better resources to work around these climate issues. And the host communities then react to these immigrant groups negatively. And we've seen spikes in xenophobia across the world, particularly in the West and in Europe, that are all connected to some of these issues. Just to give one example, the fighting in Syria is a great case example of the impact of drought. Rainfall patterns changed, food availability was impacted, and then people started to contest the leadership, and that was not accepted, of course, by Bashar al-Assad, and it led to a rebellion that led to incredible violence that has led to death and displacement throughout the region that has had significant ancillary effects and impacts, all kind of grounded in what might be one of the most important climate-driven conflicts of recent times. So there are lots of examples, and there are lots of ways that it's tied into the dynamics that drive identity crises and identity conflicts.
James said that so well. Climate change is more than just sea level rise. Of course, it is these changing weather patterns that affect food systems. Probably one of the main things to lift up is the migration. that results when people can no longer feed their families and are that desperate that they need to leave. And that did, of course, happen in the 2010 drought in Syria, and it has happened also from Central America in what's known as the dry corridor, where there's a lot of migration coming from. The UN estimates over around 200 million people migrating due to climate impacts by 2050. There was a World Bank study in 2018 that estimated 143 million by 2030 from Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa alone. So it's important to note also that that the hottest parts of the world also have fastest growing populations. And so we need to be able to anticipate what is coming. And religious communities have, as James, the skills and the relationships and the networks and the sensibilities to be able to mitigate this type of conflict, to be able to anticipate and to build the kind of resilience that is needed in this extraordinary time.
Let me add one thing too. Karenna and I were speaking yesterday, and she raised an excellent point, which is when we talk about migration, oftentimes we think about these kind of cross-border transnational migrant routes, but there's also an incredible rural to urban migration that has happened over the last several decades. And the poverty in rural areas is quite different than poverty in urban areas. When you're out in rural communities, oftentimes the community will work together to help solve problems that are created by food scarcity or water scarcity. People can go to their neighbors and they can rely on one another and they can collectively try to solve these problems. When you get into an urban setting, oftentimes where there's very little infrastructure, very little governance, if there is governance, oftentimes it's corrupt. And these people appear in these peripheral urban areas with very little access to education, to economic opportunities. And when you're living in a city and you don't have material wealth, you don't have access to food and water, then it's very different. You don't have a community to rely on. Oftentimes folks are living on the streets, quite frankly, or in shanty towns, and they will do what they need to do to survive, just as any of us would do. And that significantly increases the kind of conflict that happens within these kind of forgotten urban peripheral communities. And it's very, very different when you live with that kind of poverty in an urban space. So that migration is critically important as well. And that's been significantly impacted by the changes in climate. Climate not only brings change in rainfall, but it brings in different insects. It brings in different diseases that people and crops are not accustomed to. And we're seeing an incredible effect on livelihood and food availability in some of these areas that's driving this kind of migration as well.
Karenna, why do you see this as an important issue for religious communities to make themselves aware of? And along with that, what are ways that you see what role do you see religious communities being able to play in helping mitigate some of this violence that might be attached to or related to climate change?
So many people in the world derive their values from their religious traditions and identity. And it is, this can happen for the good, and it can sometimes happen for the bad. So I think it is incredibly important that we recognize and see how powerful religion and faith are. And there are ways in which we've seen throughout the world. For example, it can be used for good. Bishop Tutu said in the movement against apartheid in South Africa, the scriptural teachings about every human being made in the image of God were key to ending apartheid. Of course, we saw with Gandhi and Satyagraha and Ahimsa, and these concepts were used against British imperial rule. And in this country, we have examples, the main one being Martin Luther King Jr. leading as a Baptist pastor and bringing these issues, which might have been seen as political issues, into a moral conversation that was about right and wrong, that drew from people's very deep-seated values and kind of invited a sense of belonging that was outside of partisan and political affiliation. And I think in a situation, in the situation we're in now, where there's going to be increasing strain and pressure and tension because of climate impacts and also because of the kind of system that is extracting and exploiting so many people's ecosystems, we can have leadership from faith communities that brings it into a place of moral discourse about right and wrong, and also can lift up nonviolence. That is a really strong tradition within a lot of faith communities, and it takes that kind of moral and spiritual leadership and grounding and core to try to forge a different way when there is a sense of desperation. And I would say also that, on the front end, the climate impacts as they come, the stronger storms, the droughts, the heat waves, the rising sea levels, that's one thing that we have to deal with in terms of the religion and diplomacy around climate change. There's also on the front end, the level of cause. When the fossil fuel energy extraction system and how that operates, the way that the big multinational agricultural corporations are operating on local food systems, on that level, there's also an opportunity for faith communities to be leading the way. And because the way it is now, too much of the world is being ignored in their own belief systems and values and ways of being. And Pope Francis says this very well in Laudato Si, that part of the problem is that there's not enough contact with people who are really excluded from the decision making, and that includes diplomacy. And so one of the things that religion and diplomacy can do in this situation is to actually be with and among the people in the real values that they're living, and take the best of that to help forge a better way.
Are there examples that you can point to of religious communities who are doing some of this work right now?
May I give a couple examples, if you don't mind, Karenna? Yeah. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we're all kind of familiar with the oft-quoted Pew Research report saying 84% of the global population adheres to a religious belief and derives their, some of their sense of who they are in the world primarily from their faith and the faith doctrines. So faith operates in a couple of different ways in communities, right? I mean, one of the important things that religion offers is access, particularly to hard to reach places. And that can be great for distribution of resources. It can also be great for communicating from communities that are removed from power centers right up to the centers of power. I mean, what other institution can talk to the president of a country and also to people who are farming in rural areas? Oftentimes it's only faith communities that have that reach. And so one example of the way infrastructures function, when I was in South Sudan and we were preparing for the referendum for independence there that had come out of many, many years of violent conflict with what is now the northern part, or Sudan, they used the churches as places where people would meet for polling and for voting, because everyone knew where they were and they were relatively safe. And people would not assault them because they had a certain sense of the sacredness of that space. So just the infrastructure allowed for people to be able to utilize that to advance, social processes that helped resolve conflict issues. I think of charismatic leadership as one thing that happens within faith communities. You know, the ability to sort of define a group through moral leadership or even concepts of belonging. And so when I was in Cambodia, for example, the Dhammayitra movement, Mahagosananda, who decided to walk home to Cambodia from Thailand through the midst of the violent conflict there, and led a whole phalanx of nuns and monks that then essentially brought the war to a standstill, the conflict to a standstill, because they had such a sacred presence that people were not willing to shoot them as they stood in the way of the bullets. And then there's, you know, there's ultimately individual moral decision. You know, we call on one another to make life changes around these issues of climate impact, and we have to do that. How we use energy, how we create waste. And there is a through line in human spirituality, whether it's you know, doctrinal religion, whether it's pre-colonial traditions, or even non-religious spirituality, that calls for care, compassion, and stewardship. And I think that is a powerful connective tissue that runs across different faith traditions and expressions of religion and spirituality that can bring us together despite these identity and doctrinal differences. So there's quite a powerful set of tools, if you want to look at it in a kind of utilitarian fashion, where faith and religion and religious communities can stand up and stand together to help push forward solutions to these problems that very few other institutions have the ability to do.
Yeah. I can give an example from my experience, if you want to stay with that question, or we can move on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the example that comes to mind is actually from within the United States in my experience, but the wonderful thing about, one of the wonderful things about working with religion and faith is that it's a different lens through which to see the world. So it disrupts the kind of national identity, because you have Christian people in different countries and Buddhist people in different countries and Muslim and so on. And so I do think that we can actually use it for that creative energy to try to, in this time where we're getting a lesson about the sort of essential oneness of life and sharing this planet, use that to sort of see that nation states are not the only way that human beings are organized on this planet. There are also other ways in which we can come together. So the example that came to mind was from just last year, when I was working with a community in Virginia, where my mother's family is from, and I grew up largely in Virginia. And they were objecting to the placement of a giant fracked gas compressor station on a pipeline that was going to be in a historically African American community. And amazingly, given the odds, they won this fight. And as I witnessed it, it was largely due to the level of commitment and the clarity and the grounding and the strength that came from the interfaith work that happened. And that was between a Black Baptist community and a community called Yogaville, where Swami Dayanananda was her name, was leading the way. And there was a very concerted effort to have prayer and have a ceremonial approach to taking meals together, to setting your intention before a march, for example, in a way that I think qualitatively changed the nature of the resistance to that compressor station. Because in any of these situations where there is something destructive towards a community, there can be the impulse to finger point and blame and turn on each other, or you can appeal to some higher sense of purpose that brings you together and clarifies what's happening and brings people to a greater level of commitment. And so I saw that work in an interfaith way in Virginia. I also was able to travel last year to Recife, Brazil, and participate in an interfaith ceremony there in the oldest synagogue in the Americas, actually. And it was seeing people come together that were from not only the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but also from indigenous traditions and the Candomblé tradition, which mixes African traditional religion. And so to see an interfaith group that honors those indigenous traditions for their own spiritual sovereignty also helps you to see through a different lens how it feels to them to have the Amazon being destroyed in the way that it is, because it's an issue also of religious freedom. So participating and witnessing that gave me also faith in the power of religion and diplomacy to be a force for good, peacemaking with each other and also with the earth, with the ecosystems we're living in, to stop the trajectory of being against the laws of nature and instead live in balance and harmony.
That's a great example. May I add one as well, if
Sure.
If I might. I've worked many years in Latin America with indigenous communities there as well, and so I really resonate with that, Karenna. And but we at ICRD, we have 21 years now of working on precisely this issue. How does faith or faith communities or religious actors, how do they play an important role in transforming the dynamics of violent conflicts? And I'll just share one that then touches also on this environmental issue. One of the great drivers of extremism, and that can be any kind of extremism. I think sometimes we only focus on certain small slices of extremism right now in our sort of political narratives, but there are extremisms running throughout lots of our communities around the world, and one of the great drivers of that is lack of opportunity and lack of the ability to support yourself and your family. And it offers opportunities for people to identify with a group and also to provide for either in this world or the next for their needs. And so we work in Yemen, and we have been working there since before the war broke out. And one of the spaces in which we work was severely affected by drought, severely affected by the collapse of the government and their inability to provide infrastructure, and severely impacted by extremist organizations, violent religious extremist organizations that were recruiting the young people there. And we talked to tribal and religious leaders in that space about how to resolve conflict issues. And the thing that they brought up specifically was that water was one of the great drivers of violence. There was very little water in the area, and different communities were fighting over it, and the extremist organizations were trying to gain control over it. And so we supported a water infrastructure program, which is not our usual kind of work. We usually work much more on dialogue and reconciliation types of programming, but we supported a water infrastructure program. And what they did is the religious actors went to the young people who were being recruited by Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates, and with a spiritual narrative and a community narrative, they brought them into these programs so that they would commit their energies to actually helping develop necessary infrastructures so that the communities could be improved and could have their basic needs met, in this case, water. And these kids joined this operation, and they helped build these piping infrastructures. And afterwards, they said, we always thought the government needed to do this kind of stuff. And when the government disappeared, we turned to the extremist groups to help us, because they were coming in and providing for basic needs. Very little of their engagement with the community was around the things that we think of around ideology. A lot of it was around basic needs. And so they said, in the end, we don't need them anymore, and we will reject them, and we will find ways to do this together as community members and as members of this religious community. And not only did they do that project, but then they went out and they talked to surrounding communities, raised their own funds, and did additional water infrastructure programs on their own with at-risk youth from these faith communities. So it can have incredible impacts when you address some of these drivers, not just on the basic needs and some of the issues around how climate affects people's water and food availability, but it transfers then into having ancillary benefits that are associated with countering radicalization and countering extremism and countering conflict dynamics. So it's incredibly important work. And I think these examples of how faith leaders, spiritual leaders can drive this work forward, bringing communities together around these principles of stewardship is essential and should not be overlooked.
My last question, kind of, where do you see religious communities and leaders being most effective in kind of these situations where conflicts are arising out of climate impacts and rising temperatures? Do you see it more kind of in a proactive sense before those kind of conflicts begin, or are they, can they play a role once in lessening tensions once conflicts do start to develop?
James?
Yeah, let me take a minute, and then I'd like Karenna to have the last word. So we think in terms of a conflict curve, right? There's pre-conflict, there's the period during the conflict, and then there's a post-conflict period. And each of the interventions at those different spaces is going to be significantly different. To stop conflict from erupting is a very different kind of approach and methodology and engagement than to get people to stop shooting each other once they've actively started. And then to recover itself is an entirely different approach. So religious communities can play a role in all three of those spaces. We work with some faith leaders on de-radicalization of extremists, people who are very much involved in violence or committed to violence. But we also work on the kind of interfaith work that Karenna's talking about, where we break down identity divisions and prejudices that might lead to conflict but have not yet, where we rehumanize the other before that dehumanization has gotten to the point where people are committing violence against one another. And of course, it's critically important after a community has been broken by violence that faith leaders, spiritual leaders can step forward and help heal that community on the heels of violence. There's again, a very important shared value in spiritual practice that focuses on healing. And some of that we work with in terms of reconciliation processes and how those can be advanced. And would love to share stories about, particularly in Colombia, the indigenous and the Abrahamic traditions working together, not only to advance reconciliation, but to deepen their own understanding of it by hearing from the other community what their spiritual framework was. And they've learned about different principles associated with reconciliation that they had not had within their own spiritual framework because they were exposed to others. There are great, rich stories to tell about this stuff, and would love to do that if we had more time, but I will leave it there and pass the mic over to Karenna to finish the conversation for us and just say thank you.
Thank you. Well, I agree. I concur that there's a space for religious communities, religious actors in different phases and aspects of conflict, preventing it and helping to resolve it. It is the case that what religion and spirituality has to offer is directly matched with what can be the deciding factor in resolving some of these conflicts: forgiveness, redemption, changing your sense of belonging to include those who you considered to be the enemy or the other. That is a place where faith leaders obviously can play a very positive role, and it will depend on the situation how that plays out. But I think when it comes to preventing conflict, there are in the case of climate and environmental issues, I think it's very important to look at the trajectory that we're on right now in the world, that we do, although we know now the cause and effect, we know the urgency of shifting to another energy system. The world still gets 80% of our energy from fossil fuels. And half of the global warming emissions that are up in the atmosphere now have been put up there in the last 20 years, which is the time that we've known the most about this and had the most available alternatives. So in terms of mitigating conflict, because we know that climate disruptions will lead to migration, will lead to conflict, mitigating conflict for religious actors also means changing this trajectory that we're on. Questioning and telling the truth, which is also such a part of prophetic tradition, and certainly in the Judeo-Christian heritage that Pope Francis has very wisely drawn on for his work in speaking out about climate. That we must look at the truth and we must tell the truth, no matter how difficult it is for people to hear. So I think that it's important to realize that the arguments that are made for continuing on this trajectory are often made that we need to have economic growth to end poverty, no matter whether there's a lot of pollution and depletion or not. It doesn't matter. It's so urgent to have economic growth to end poverty. And so we need to be understanding that, in fact, it's a very counterproductive model that we have now. We've had many people do studies. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Philip Alston, explained in a report that actually this climate change would undo the last 50 years of progress and drive over 100 million more people into poverty. So I think it's important to look at the when you talk about this trajectory, about this development paradigm, we need to be asking the deep, serious questions about what is development for? What is the meaning of life? How do you measure a good society? And for those things, we need to be very mindful and respectful of the spiritual and faith communities that have been thinking about these things in their own contexts for many generations. And they ought to be consulted about any development that affects their community. These are people who should have a seat at the table. And the faith leaders can be part of the conversation, setting a conversation based around ethics. So it's not just about money, it's about well-being. And it's about what we want to be handing down to the future generations that we are proud of and that is sustainable. It's going to be a big shift that we're in the middle of, and so I'm really excited. Let me say in closing, to be connected to ICRD. I really respect the work that they have done, the expertise that they have, and I hope that from where I sit at Center for Earth Ethics, we're going to be able to work collaboratively with many partners to be able to rise to the occasion. This is a really big challenge. We know that it's here and we know that it's coming with stronger force. And if faith communities can step up and do this in a good way, we can make the world better in the process. So thank you for the questions.
Let me also just say that I'm very grateful to be connected with the Center for Earth Ethics and Karenna. And you raise an incredibly important point, the difference between short-term and long-term thinking around these issues. You know, what do we sacrifice in the long term for short-term gains? One last kind of conundrum that I will throw out there, when you're working with religious communities, we have to recognize that not all religious concepts and ideologies are constructive. You know, it is not a question of is religion good or bad. Religion can be both and has been both. And there are religious actors out there who are ideologically committed to the idea that their sense of divinity and relationship with the divine compels them to care for and protect all people, all of creation, even outside of their identity group. But there are others who are equally committed to the idea that the protections provided by their relationship with the divine are exclusive and are reserved to their group. And they are willing to advance conflict, and they're willing to undermine the protections of others based on those ideological perceptions. And so there is a conflict within faith traditions themselves over who and how the divine manifests into the community, and what principles are going to be brought forward with respect to people that do not belong to that same community. And so I think we have to be very attentive to that, aware of it, and really kind of try to leverage the former against the latter, and advance this idea that all life is sacred, and elevate the best of our traditions that adhere to that principle.
Well, thank you both for taking the time to speak with EarthBeat today. For our viewers, if you're interested in more coverage, you can always check us out at www.ncronline.org/EarthBeat. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.